The woman at the school awards ceremony told me I couldn't possibly understand the essay in front of me. I wrote it. I was standing near my award-winning essay display when a woman in an expensive suit approached me and said, "This essay is clearly written by one of those broke scholarship kids." Mrs. Kirk, according to her PTA president badge, gestured dismissively. They always try so hard to sound sophisticated. I sipped my juice and stayed quiet. The showcase was anonymous, all essays displayed with just grade levels, not names. She had no idea she was talking to the author. You can tell by the desperation in it. She turned to include other parents who'd started listening. Poor kids always write these sob stories, thinking tragedy equals depth. It's so transparent. Maybe the writer actually experienced what they wrote about? I suggested mildly. She laughed. Oh, I'm sure they did. That's the problem. Kids from broken homes always think their dysfunction makes them special. This reeks of food stamps and therapy sessions. I watched her point at my favorite paragraph, the one about how books could be mirrors and windows, how the right story at the right time could save someone. I'd written that after my best friend attempted sewer slide and told me later that a book I'd recommended kept her holding on. See this metaphor about mirrors and windows? Trying so hard to sound intellectual. She was building momentum. You can practically smell the desperation. Some guidance counselor probably told them writing would be their ticket out. When I mentioned the essay seemed genuine, she scoffed. Genuine? This is poverty popcornography. Look at this section about absent mothers. These kids always blame their parents instead of taking responsibility. No wonder they end up how they do. That section had taken me 3 weeks to write, trying to explain how it felt when my mom left without making it sound like I was asking for pity. The sentence structure alone screams, trying too hard. She was typing furiously on her phone. My daughter Brittany, she goes to the new academy. Now she writes with natural elegance. Real breeding shows. She showed her phone to the gathered parents. I'm texting the other board members. We need to discuss having separate categories. It's not fair to make real students compete against charity cases. A father in the group nodded. My daughter entered too. She shouldn't have to compete against kids gaming the system with sob stories. Exactly. Mrs. Kirk seized on the support. These kids think victimhood is a personality. They probably spent more time crafting their tragedy than actually writing. She turned back to the essay display. And the worst part? This child, whoever they are, is learning that whining works. That you can manipulate your way to success with a sad story. What if the story is actually true, though? I asked quietly. She sneered. Oh, I'm sure it's true. That's what makes it so pathetic. Using your family's failures for sympathy points? Real winners overcome. They don't advertise their damage. She addressed the crowd again. I bet when they call this winner up, it'll be some kid with secondhand clothes and a rehearsed speech about overcoming adversity. Mark my words. Several parents nodded. One mentioned knowing someone at the newspaper who'd love this angle. Another started taking photos of my essay. The principal's voice came over the speaker system announcing it was time for the awards presentation. Everyone started moving toward the auditorium. Mrs. Kirk put away her phone with satisfaction. I guarantee this winner will be exactly what I described. Probably hasn't showered properly. Will stumble over big words. You can always tell breeding. We filed into the auditorium. I found a seat near the back while Mrs. Kirk positioned herself prominently in the front row, phone ready. The principal began announcing awards. Each winner walked across the stage and Mrs. Kirk scrutinized each one. And now for our grand prize winner, the principal announced. This essay moved all our judges to tears. Mrs. Kirk sat forward eagerly, phone raised to record. We'd like to invite our winner to share a few words about their writing process. Please welcome to the stage, Elizabeth Shanna from Jefferson Middle School. I stood up from my seat in the back, walked past rows of parents, past Mrs. Kirk, whose face was starting to change, climbed the stairs to the stage where the principal handed me the microphone. Hello, I'm Elizabeth Shanna. I wrote that essay. I stared right at Mrs. Kirk. Nobody moved. The auditorium stayed completely quiet, and I watched Mrs. Kirk's face change from confused to understanding to something that looked like fear. Her phone dropped to her lap. The principal touched my shoulder and nodded like she wanted me to keep talking. Everyone stared at me waiting. I gripped the microphone tighter and cleared my throat. I talked about the mirrors and windows metaphor for maybe 2 minutes, explaining how I wrote it 7 different ways before it felt right. I mentioned reading examples from other writers and studying how they built their comparisons. I didn't say anything about my mom or my friend or Mrs. Kirk's comments. I just focused on the actual writing part, the craft stuff. When I finished, people clapped and I walked back down the stage stairs. A girl with a press badge on her shirt stopped me near my row. She asked if I'd answer some questions for the school paper. I said maybe and kept walking toward the exit. The counselor caught me in the hallway before I made it outside. She smiled, but it looked worried. She said she heard some of what happened before the ceremony and asked if we could talk privately. We walked to her office and she closed the door behind us. She offered me a bottle of water from her mini fridge. I took it even though I wasn't thirsty. She asked how I felt about what just happened. I shrugged and said I didn't know yet. She pulled out a notebook and started explaining my options. I could file a complaint with the district PTA about what Mrs. Kirk said. I could write down everything I remembered her saying and submit it as documentation. Or I could just process it privately and not do anything official. She made it clear that all those choices were okay, and I didn't have to decide right then. I felt weird suddenly having options when 10 minutes ago I just wanted to leave and forget about it. My brain felt full and empty at the same time. That evening, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Text after text from people in my grade who were there or saw video clips already going around on parent chat groups and student accounts. Some people called it powerful and said I handled it perfectly. Others said it was just drama or claimed Mrs. Kirk was taken out of context, and I made it seem worse than it was. Someone sent me a screenshot from a parent group where people were arguing about whether Mrs. Kirk meant anything bad or if I was too sensitive. I turned my phone face down on my desk, but it kept vibrating. I tried to do homework, but couldn't focus on math problems when my head was full of everything else. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying Mrs. Kirk's exact words in my head. Poverty pornography, broken homes, kids who think their dysfunction makes them special. She took my essay, the one I worked on for weeks, and turned it into a stereotype. She didn't see the writing or the craft or the hours I spent on that mirrors and windows paragraph. She just saw what she expected to see. Part of me wanted to file that complaint and make sure everyone knew exactly what she said. But another part worried about what would happen if I did. More attention, more people picking sides, more comments online. My stomach hurt thinking about it. The next morning, the librarian stopped me in the hallway before first period. She put her hand on my arm gently and told me that paragraph about mirrors and windows was exactly why she became a librarian in the first place. She said books really do save people, and my essay captured that perfectly. Then she invited me to read at a community literacy event next month. She said they needed student voices, and mine mattered. Her words felt like cool water after yesterday's burn. I said yes without thinking about it. In English class, I noticed people whispering and looking at me sideways. My teacher started the lesson on our current novel study without mentioning the awards ceremony at all. She asked questions about the book and called on students and acted like everything was normal. It felt protective but also isolating, like everyone was pretending nothing happened. I wanted someone to acknowledge it but also didn't want to talk about it. The whole thing made me feel disconnected from the room. The principal sent an email to all families that afternoon. I read it on my phone between classes. It talked about maintaining respectful discourse in our school community and celebrating student achievement. The whole thing was diplomatic and neutral and didn't actually say anything specific. I felt frustrated that the administration wouldn't name what actually happened. They made it sound like some vague issue instead of a specific adult saying specific cruel things about student work. The student paper published a brief article the next day with a photo of me on stage holding the microphone. The article was fine, just basic facts about the awards ceremony and the winning essays. But the online comments section filled up fast. Some people wrote supportive messages saying they were proud of me. Others left thinly veiled remarks about playing the victim card or using sob stories for attention. Someone wrote that scholarship kids always make everything about their struggles. Reading through them made me feel exposed in a way I didn't expect. I thought claiming authorship would feel powerful, but instead it felt like I'd opened myself up to everyone's opinions about my life and my family and my worth as a writer. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend around 10 that night. She asked if anyone would figure out she was the person in my essay, the one who almost killed herself. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back that I would never confirm who inspired what parts. She sent back a thumbs up, but I could feel her worry through the screen. I hadn't thought about how going public with my name meant potentially exposing her too. The essay talked about someone I cared about, someone who told me a book saved their life, but I never named her, and now I needed to make sure I kept it that way. I added that the essay was about lots of things, not just one person or one moment, trying to give her cover if anyone asked. The next afternoon, I was scrolling through the PTA website between classes when I saw the agenda for their next meeting. Right there under new business was an item about ensuring fairness in student competitions and considering separate contest categories. My stomach dropped. They weren't backing off or apologizing. They were doubling down. Mrs. Kirk and her friends were actually trying to change the rules because I won. The anger that had been sitting heavy in my chest sharpened into something more focused. This wasn't just about her saying mean things anymore. She was trying to make sure kids like me couldn't compete at all. The counselor found me in the library during study hall and asked if we could talk. We went back to her office and she closed the door. I admitted I was thinking about filing a complaint, but I didn't know if it was worth the hassle. She pulled out a notepad and helped me think through what I actually wanted to happen versus what might realistically happen through official channels. Did I want Mrs. Kirk fired? Did I want a public apology? Did I want policy changes? I realized I mostly wanted her to face some kind of consequence, and for the school to acknowledge what she said was wrong. The counselor explained that formal complaints go to the district PTA office, and they have specific procedures for investigating parent conduct. She said it might not result in everything I wanted, but it would create an official record. That evening, I sat at my desk trying to draft a personal statement. I kept starting and deleting. Finally, I decided to focus on the craft and work behind my essay instead of defending my right to write about hard stuff. I wrote about how I revised that mirrors and windows paragraph 7 times before it felt right, how I spent hours choosing specific words, how I cut 3 whole pages because they didn't serve the central idea. The words came easier when I focused on the writing itself, rather than trying to prove I deserved to win. I saved the document and felt slightly less powerless. The next morning, a parent I didn't know stopped me in the hallway before first period. She had this really warm smile and touched my arm while praising my courage and resilience. She used words like inspiring and brave and told me I was such a strong young woman. I thanked her politely, but the whole interaction made me uncomfortable. She wasn't really seeing me as a person. I was more like an inspirational poster to her, some symbol of overcoming adversity. Her kindness felt performative, like she wanted credit for being nice to the poor scholarship kid. I excused myself and headed to class feeling weird about the whole thing. In the cafeteria at lunch, I noticed Brittany sitting with her friends at a table near the windows. She saw me looking and immediately turned away, focusing really hard on her sandwich. I wondered what her house was like right now with a mother who just publicly embarrassed herself. Mrs. Kirk seemed like the type who would take her anger out on everyone around her. Despite everything her mom said, despite the PTA meeting agenda item, I felt a flicker of sympathy for Brittany. She didn't choose her mother. She was stuck dealing with the fallout of adult decisions just like I was stuck dealing with my mom leaving. Being the daughter in that situation probably sucked in ways I couldn't fully understand. The librarian caught me after lunch and asked if I had a few minutes. We sat at a table in the back corner and she told me about an idea she had. She wanted to organize a community read focused on books that build empathy and understanding across different experiences. She said my essay's central metaphor about mirrors and windows inspired her. The program would bring together students, parents, and community members to read and discuss books that showed different perspectives. She asked if I would be willing to help plan it, and maybe share that paragraph at the first meeting. For the first time since the award ceremony, I felt something other than anger or anxiety. This was something constructive coming out of the mess. I said yes. Late that night, I was brushing my teeth when my phone buzzed with a notification. Someone sent me a message through the school portal. It was anonymous, and the message made me feel sick. They threatened to expose exactly how poor my family really was. They mentioned specific assistance programs by name, things only someone with access to private information would know. They said everyone would find out the truth about what kind of family I came from. I screenshot the message with shaking hands and saved it to 3 different places. The violation of it made my skin crawl. Someone was digging into my private life and threatening me with it. I barely slept that night. First thing in the morning, I showed the counselor everything. The student reporter messaged me during second period asking if we could meet. We found an empty classroom and she showed me her phone. She had screenshots of PTA group texts where multiple parents discussed strategies for changing the contest rules. Mrs. Kirk wasn't the only one. There were at least 5 other parents in the conversation talking about separate categories and fairness, and how scholarship students had unfair advantages because they could write sob stories. The evidence was right there proving this wasn't just one person's comments. It was a whole group of parents who thought the same way. I felt vindicated seeing the proof, but also wary. This was becoming a bigger public battle than I wanted. The reporter asked if she could write about it for the school paper. I told her I needed to think about it. The counselor helped me put together a formal complaint that afternoon. We sat in her office with the door closed and went through everything methodically. Mrs. Kirk's specific statements at the showcase, the context of her not knowing I was the author, the public nature of her comments, the subsequent PTA meeting agenda item, the anonymous harassment message with private information. We documented dates, times, witnesses who were present. The counselor showed me how to attach the screenshots as evidence. The whole process felt bureaucratic but also empowering. I was taking concrete action instead of just absorbing harm. We submitted the complaint to the district PTA office through their official portal. The confirmation email said someone would contact me within 3 business days. I left the counselor's office feeling like I'd actually done something that mattered. I checked my email obsessively for the next 2 days, refreshing the inbox every hour between classes and during lunch. The district PTA office response arrived Thursday morning while I was in history class. My phone buzzed and I waited until the teacher turned to write on the board before checking it. The email acknowledged receipt of my complaint and outlined a formal review process that would take approximately 4 to 6 weeks. They listed specific steps including witness interviews, documentation review, and a hearing if necessary. The timeline felt both reassuring and exhausting. I appreciated knowing exactly what would happen and when, but 6 weeks seemed impossibly long to wait for any kind of resolution. The email ended with a reminder that all parties would be notified of findings and that the process aimed to ensure fairness for everyone involved. I saved the email to 3 different folders and screenshot it for backup. The counselor had warned me that institutional processes move slowly, but seeing the actual timeline made the slowness real. I spent the rest of history class staring at my notebook without taking any notes. My English teacher handed back our personal narrative assignments during 4th period. I opened the folder nervously, expecting comments about my content or questions about my family situation. Instead, the feedback focused entirely on technical elements. She circled places where my sentence structure could be tightened, suggested stronger word choices in 3 paragraphs, and wrote detailed notes about how my argument could be clearer in the conclusion. Not a single comment mentioned the personal details I'd shared or the emotional content of the piece. The last note at the bottom said my metaphor development showed real skill, and I should keep pushing myself to find unexpected comparisons. I read through the feedback twice, feeling something settle in my chest. She was treating me like a writer, not like a tragedy. The emphasis on craft reminded me that I had actual skills beyond just having experienced hard things. I folded the paper carefully and put it in my backpack, wanting to keep that feeling close. Friday afternoon, the counselor called me down to her office during study hall. She showed me an email that had been sent to the principal and copied to the entire PTA board. The subject line read, "Concerns about targeting and harassment." I felt my stomach drop before I even started reading. The email was from Mrs. Kirk. She claimed she was bullied and targeted for simply expressing concerns about contest integrity. She said multiple parents shared her questions about fairness, and that she was silenced for asking legitimate questions about standards. The email painted her as someone trying to protect educational quality while being attacked for having opinions. She mentioned feeling unsafe and questioned whether the school environment was becoming hostile to parent involvement. The counselor watched my face as I read. She told me this was a common defensive tactic when people faced accountability. They reframe themselves as victims and try to make the complaint process seem like persecution. She said not to let it derail my complaint or make me second-guess what I'd documented. The facts were clear, and witnesses had heard what was actually said. I nodded but felt shaken anyway. Seeing Mrs. Kirk twist everything made me angry in a new way. She wasn't just refusing to acknowledge what she'd done. She was actively trying to make herself look like the wronged party. The student reporter texted me over the weekend asking if I'd seen the school paper's online edition. I pulled it up on my phone and found an interview with Mrs. Kirk in the Community Voices section. The reporter had somehow gotten her to go on record. Mrs. Kirk talked about the need for academic standards and ensuring fairness in competitions. She said it was important that contests recognize genuine achievement rather than emotional appeals. She mentioned that some students had natural advantages in writing about hardship, and that didn't necessarily reflect superior skill. The reporter asked directly if she regretted her comments at the showcase. Mrs. Kirk said she stood by her concerns about contest structure and believed honest discussion about standards benefited everyone. She never apologized. She never acknowledged that her specific words had been cruel or that assuming things about anonymous students was wrong. Reading the quotes made something click into place for me. I'd been holding on to some small hope that she might eventually apologize or show she understood why her comments were harmful. Seeing her double down in print killed that hope. She wasn't going to acknowledge the harm. She was going to keep insisting her concerns were legitimate and that she'd done nothing wrong. I felt sad about it for maybe 10 minutes, then mostly just tired. At least now I knew for sure. Monday morning announcements included a reminder about the upcoming PTA meeting and mentioned there would be a public comment period for community members. The counselor caught me after second period and suggested we talk about whether I wanted to attend. We sat in her office and she explained that speaking during public comment was completely optional. She said I wasn't obligated to perform my pain publicly or to educate people about why classism was harmful. If I did want to speak, she recommended bringing support people and preparing remarks that focused on policy recommendations rather than personal grievance. That approach would feel less vulnerable and might be more effective anyway. She emphasized multiple times that not speaking was also a valid choice. I told her I needed to think about it. She handed me a template for public comment that outlined how to structure policy-focused remarks. I spent my lunch period in the library drafting possible things I could say. The words came easier when I focused on concrete changes rather than trying to explain how Mrs. Kirk's comments had felt. My friend group had strong opinions about whether I should speak at the PTA meeting. We sat together at lunch Tuesday, and the conversation got heated. Two of my friends thought speaking would be brave and important, that staying silent would let Mrs. Kirk and the other parents think their behavior was acceptable. They said someone needed to call out the classism directly. Three other friends worried I'd face more harassment if I spoke publicly, that it would make me a bigger target and invite more cruel comments online. They thought the formal complaint was enough, and I didn't need to expose myself further. One friend stayed quiet through most of the argument, then finally said she thought it was my choice, and everyone needed to stop pressuring me either way. The conversation made me realize there was no option that would satisfy everyone or keep me completely safe. Whatever I decided, some people would think I'd made the wrong call. The social cost of this whole situation was becoming clearer. Even my friends who supported me had different ideas about what support should look like. I left lunch feeling more confused than before. Thursday afternoon, I was walking to my locker when I heard raised voices near the main hallway display cases. The librarian was standing between Mrs. Kirk and the student work displays, her arms crossed. Mrs. Kirk had her phone out like she'd been taking pictures. The librarian's voice carried down the hall as she cited privacy policies and explained that photographing student work without permission violated district guidelines. Mrs. Kirk argued that the displays were public and she had a right to document concerns. The librarian didn't back down. She told Mrs. Kirk she needed to leave the area immediately, or the librarian would file a formal complaint with administration. Mrs. Kirk put her phone away with obvious anger and walked toward the exit. The librarian stayed there until Mrs. Kirk was completely gone, then started checking the displays like she was making sure nothing had been damaged. I felt grateful seeing an adult willing to set boundaries even when it was uncomfortable. The librarian caught my eye from down the hall and gave me a small nod. That tiny protective victory made the week feel slightly less heavy. Friday evening, I was scrolling through social media when I saw a post from a local community website. They'd published the full list of award winners from the essay contest, complete with names, grades, and schools. My name was right there, fully searchable online. Anyone could find it now. My identity was permanently connected to the contest and the controversy. I felt a fresh wave of anxiety wash over me. Before, the attention had mostly stayed within school boundaries. Now anyone in the community could search my name and find the whole story. The permanence of it scared me. I texted the counselor even though it was late, just saying I was freaking out about the online post. She called me back within 20 minutes. We talked for almost an hour about how I couldn't control information spread once things went public. She helped me understand that while I couldn't control what other people posted or how they framed things, I could control my own responses. I could decide what I engaged with and what I ignored. I could set boundaries about what I shared going forward. The conversation didn't make the anxiety disappear, but it made it feel more manageable. Monday, between second and third period, I locked myself in a bathroom stall and couldn't breathe. The sustained attention and conflict had built up over days and suddenly crashed down all at once. My chest felt tight and my hands were shaking and I couldn't get enough air. Everything felt too big and too much and I didn't know how to make it stop. Someone must have heard me struggling because the counselor appeared outside the stall asking if I was okay. She talked me through breathing exercises, counting breaths in and out, having me name things I could see and touch. After maybe 10 minutes, the panic started to ease. We sat on the bathroom floor and she told me that what I was experiencing was a completely normal response to abnormal stress. She said panic attacks didn't mean I was weak or overreacting. They meant my nervous system was overwhelmed by sustained threat and conflict. The validation that I wasn't just being dramatic helped almost as much as the breathing exercises. She wrote me a pass for third period and walked me to her office where I could sit quietly until I felt steady again. That evening, a message notification popped up on my school portal. It was from Brittany Kirk. My stomach clenched before I even opened it. The message asked me not to destroy her mother's reputation. Brittany explained that things at home had been terrible since the awards ceremony. Her mother was stressed and angry all the time. She said she knew what her mother had said was wrong, but begged me to understand the pressure Brittany was under. She wrote that her mother's entire identity was tied up in status and achievement, and losing her position on the PTA board would devastate her. Brittany said she was caught in the middle and just wanted everything to stop. Reading the message made my anger more complicated. Part of me wanted to say that adults should face consequences for their actions, and Brittany's discomfort wasn't my responsibility. But another part recognized that Brittany was stuck dealing with the fallout of her mother's choices, just like I was stuck dealing with my mother leaving. Being the daughter in that situation probably hurt in ways I couldn't fully understand. I stared at the message for a long time before closing my laptop without responding. I didn't know what to say that would be both honest and fair. The next morning, I sent Brittany a short reply saying I'd meet her in the library during lunch with the librarian nearby. I made it clear I wasn't going to apologize for filing the complaint, but I was willing to listen to what she had to say. The meeting felt risky, but also like the right thing to do. When lunch period came, I walked into the library and found Brittany sitting at a back table with her hands folded tightly together. The librarian was shelving books within sight but giving us space. I sat down across from Brittany and waited. She started talking in a quiet voice about how her mother's whole life revolved around status and achievement, how nothing was ever good enough, how her mother measured success by what other people thought and lived in constant fear of losing social standing. Brittany explained that she wasn't making excuses for what her mother said, but wanted me to understand the pressure that created those comments. She described growing up in a house where every grade, every activity, every friend had to reflect well on the family, where her mother's anxiety about appearances controlled everything. I listened and realized that Mrs. Kirk's cruelty came from her own deep insecurity, rather than calculated meanness. That didn't make the words hurt less, but it changed how I understood them. After Brittany left, I sat in the library working on homework when the student reporter slid into the chair across from me. She had her laptop open and looked excited in a careful way. She explained that while researching background for her follow-up article, she'd been reading through old PTA bylaws and meeting minutes. She'd found something interesting about how contest judges were selected in previous years. Board members' children had won the essay contest 4 out of the last 6 years. The selection process for judges wasn't clearly documented, and there seemed to be potential conflicts of interest built into the system. She asked if I'd be willing to comment on the record about systemic issues, rather than just personal conflict. I told her I needed to think about it, but thanked her for digging deeper. The revelation shifted everything from being about me and Mrs. Kirk to being about patterns that had existed for years. 2 days later, I got an email from the district liaison handling my complaint. She wrote that based on the information gathered so far, the governance review would extend beyond my specific situation to examine contest procedures more broadly. They were looking at judge selection processes, anonymity protections, and oversight mechanisms across all PTA-run competitions. She thanked me for bringing these issues to their attention, and said individual harm sometimes exposes larger patterns that need correction. Reading that made me feel like something meaningful might actually change. That same afternoon, one of the fathers who'd been in the crowd before the ceremony approached me in the hallway. He waited until other students had passed, then said he needed to apologize. He told me he'd stood there and listened to Mrs. Kirk tear apart my essay, and he hadn't said anything. He explained he'd felt uncomfortable but didn't want to cause a scene or get involved in drama. Now he realized his silence had been its own kind of participation. He asked if I'd accept a written statement from him about what he witnessed, or if I wanted him to speak at the upcoming PTA meeting. His willingness to use his position as a parent to support me felt significant. I told him a written statement would help and thanked him for coming forward. In English class the next day, my teacher announced we'd be discussing opinion pieces about education policy. She handed out several articles about socioeconomic bias in schools and how it affected everything from discipline to academic opportunities. We spent the period analyzing arguments and talking about systemic issues without anyone naming specific people or recent events. The intellectual discussion helped me feel less alone in recognizing these patterns. Other students had clearly thought about these things too. After class, my teacher pulled me aside briefly to say she was glad I was still focused on writing and learning despite everything else happening. The counselor called me to her office that afternoon and proposed something unexpected. She asked if I'd be willing to participate in a restorative justice circle with Mrs. Kirk if Mrs. Kirk agreed to it. The counselor explained it would be a facilitated conversation focused on harm, accountability, and moving forward. I thought about it for a long time before responding. I told the counselor I'd consider it, but only under strict conditions. Any conversation had to center my dignity and not require me to educate Mrs. Kirk about why her comments were harmful. I wouldn't minimize what happened or pretend it was less serious than it was. The counselor wrote down my conditions and said she'd reach out to Mrs. Kirk through official channels. A week passed before the counselor got back to me. Mrs. Kirk had declined the restorative circle through her lawyer. Instead, she was offering to provide a carefully worded written statement through official PTA channels. The lawyer's involvement and the refusal to meet face-to-face confirmed what I'd already suspected. Mrs. Kirk was more concerned with managing her reputation than genuine accountability. I told the counselor I wasn't surprised and asked what happened next with the formal complaint process. She explained the district would continue their investigation regardless of Mrs. Kirk's participation. Meanwhile, the PTA meeting was coming up in 5 days, and I needed to decide what to say during the public comment period. I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and started revising my remarks. Instead of recounting what Mrs. Kirk had said and how it made me feel, I focused on concrete policy recommendations. I wrote about anonymity protections for student work, about restrictions on photographing or recording student submissions without permission, about bias awareness training for adults who judge student competitions or serve in leadership roles. The shift from personal grievance to systemic solutions felt more powerful and less vulnerable. I practiced my remarks out loud until I could deliver them in under 3 minutes without my voice shaking. The night of the PTA meeting, I arrived early with the counselor. The room filled with parents and a few students, including the reporter with her laptop. Mrs. Kirk sat in the front row with 2 other board members. When public comment opened, I walked to the microphone and introduced myself clearly. I delivered my 3-minute statement noting specific policy gaps and requesting implementation timelines for each recommendation. I kept my tone calm and professional. I didn't mention Mrs. Kirk by name or describe what had happened at the ceremony. I focused entirely on forward-looking solutions. When I finished, several parents looked surprised, like they'd expected anger or tears. I returned to my seat and watched the rest of the meeting unfold. I watched several parents lean forward in their seats to speak during the public comment period. A woman in a blue sweater stood up first and said the anonymity policy made sense and should have been in place from the start. She mentioned how her son had been nervous about entering the contest because he worried about judgment. Another parent immediately raised his hand and talked about free speech rights, saying adults should be able to express opinions about student work without fear of punishment. He emphasized that honest feedback helps students grow and that protecting feelings over truth does everyone a disservice. A third parent, someone I recognized from volunteer days in the library, stood and apologized directly to me for not saying something when she heard the pre-ceremony comments. She admitted she had been uncomfortable but stayed quiet, and she regretted that choice. Her voice shook slightly when she spoke. The range of reactions made it clear that some people genuinely wanted change, while others saw the whole situation as an overreaction to normal adult conversation. The district liaison waited until the comment period ended, then stood at the podium with a folder of papers. She announced that starting immediately, all future contest submissions would require mandatory anonymity, with student names replaced by identification numbers. She explained that photographing or recording student work without written permission would be restricted, and anyone violating this policy would face removal from the school events. She outlined a timeline for comprehensive policy review that would take place over the next 2 months with input from students, teachers, and community members. I felt something loosen in my chest as she listed each specific change. These were concrete protections that would exist beyond my individual situation. The policies felt real and enforceable, not just empty promises to make me feel better. The meeting continued with other PTA business, and I left before it officially ended. 2 days later, someone sent me a link to a parent blog post. The headline read, "Sensitivity Culture Ruins School Traditions," and the article defended everything Mrs. Kirk had said as honest assessment of writing quality. The blogger argued that students needed to develop thicker skin and that contest judges should be able to speak freely about submissions without fear of complaints. The post had dozens of supportive comments from parents who thought the whole situation had been blown out of proportion. I read through the entire thing once, felt my anger spike, then deliberately closed the browser tab. I deleted the link from my messages and decided not to respond or share it with anyone. Fighting every battle would drain me completely. Learning when to step back and let something exist without my engagement felt like its own form of strength. Some people would never understand, and that was their problem to carry, not mine. During English class the following week, Brittany stood up to give a presentation on her independent reading project. She talked about a memoir she had read and how the author used reflection to make sense of difficult experiences. Near the end of her presentation, she mentioned how powerful it was when writers described books as windows into other people's lives. She didn't look at me or say my name, but everyone in class knew she was referencing my essay. The acknowledgement felt bittersweet because it showed she had actually read and thought about my work, but it also reminded me that real reconciliation between us probably wasn't possible. Her mother's actions had created a barrier that neither of us knew how to cross. After class, we passed each other in the hallway without speaking. The librarian stopped me at my locker that afternoon with printed flyers for a new community read program. She explained that the program would focus on books that build empathy and understanding across different experiences, directly inspired by the mirrors and windows metaphor from my essay. The sign-up sheet already had 15 names on it, which she said was modest but genuine interest for a first-time program. She asked if I would be willing to share that specific paragraph at the first session as a way to introduce the concept. I looked at the flyer and thought about whether I was ready to put those words out into the world again after everything that had happened. The idea of reading them in a supportive context with people who actually wanted to hear them felt different from having them dissected and criticized. I told her yes, I would share the paragraph. It felt like a way to reclaim that piece of writing and remind myself why I wrote it in the first place. The student reporter published a follow-up article in the school paper the next week. Instead of focusing on the drama or personal conflict, she wrote about the specific policy changes and the institutional review process the district had committed to. The article framed the story around systems improvement and highlighted how student input were included in the policy review. She quoted the district liaison and included statistics about how many schools in our area had similar anonymity protections already in place. Reading the article made me feel proud because the narrative had evolved beyond just my individual experience. The story became about making things better for future students, not just about what happened to me. The counselor called me to her office during free period, and we talked about what might happen with the formal complaint investigation. She explained that possible outcomes included formal censure that would go in Mrs. Kirk's file, required bias training before she could continue on the PTA board, or removal from the board entirely. She helped me think through what each outcome would actually mean and how to manage my expectations. I realized as we talked that I was hoping for accountability, but not destruction. I didn't want Mrs. Kirk's life ruined, but I did want her to face real consequences and understand that her words had caused harm. The counselor validated that wanting both things at once was completely reasonable. That evening, I sat at my desk with my journal and wrote about the essay section that described my mother's absence. I went back through old drafts and remembered how carefully I was chosen each word to explain the feeling without making it sound like I was asking for pity. I made decisions about what I was willing to share publicly in the future and what needed to stay private. The experience had taught me that I could write about pain and difficulty without owing strangers access to every detail of my life. Some parts of my story were mine alone, and I got to decide what I shared and what I kept protected. A reporter from the local newspaper emailed me the next day, requesting an interview about overcoming adversity through writing. The email praised my resilience and asked if I would be willing to share my story to inspire other young people facing challenges. I read the email twice, then wrote back declining the interview. I explained politely that I appreciated the interest, but didn't want to be reduced to an inspirational narrative. Saying no to attention felt powerful, rather than like a missed opportunity. I didn't need to perform my struggles for public consumption to validate my experience or my writing. My English teacher pulled me aside after class on Friday and told me she had nominated my essay for a regional writing contest. She emphasized that it was a submission based on craft, with no guaranteed outcome, and that the judges would evaluate sentence structure, metaphor development, and argumentation strength. She said my work deserved recognition for its technical skill, not just its emotional content. The focus on craft rather than story felt like exactly the kind of recognition I had actually wanted all along. 3 weeks passed with classes and homework and waiting. Then the district contact person called me to her office during lunch. She had papers in front of her and a serious expression that made my stomach tight. The investigation was done. Mrs. Kirk would get an official warning put in her file and had to complete bias awareness training before she could stay on the PTA board. It was not removal, but it was real consequences that would follow her. I nodded and thanked the contact person, feeling something settle in my chest that I had not realized was still wound up. The PTA met 2 days later, and I did not attend, but the counselor told me afterward what happened. They voted to adopt permanent rule changes. All future contest submissions had to be anonymous with no names attached. No one could photograph student work without written permission anymore. Every board member had to complete annual bias training. The policies would outlast this specific situation and protect other students. Knowing the system would be different for kids who came after me felt more important than any personal apology. Mrs. Kirk sent an email through the district contact person the next week. It came to my school email address with the contact person copied. The message said her comments had been harmful and inappropriate. She acknowledged she should not have made assumptions about students or their backgrounds. The email did not include any public statement or apology to the wider community. I read it twice and then closed my laptop. Private accountability was enough because I could not control how she managed her public image. What mattered was that she admitted harm in writing to me directly with a district official as witness. I saw Brittany in the hallway near the science labs on Thursday. We both stopped walking and stood there for a moment. Then she asked if we could talk for a minute. We moved to the side near the water fountain. She said we did not have to pretend to be friends, but we also should not speak for each other or use our mothers against each other. I agreed immediately. The practical boundary felt more honest than trying to force some kind of reconciliation neither of us wanted. We nodded at each other and went to our separate classes. The community read program started the following Tuesday evening in the library. About 15 people showed up, including some parents and a few other students. The librarian asked if I would share the mirrors and windows paragraph. I stood up and read it aloud, my voice steady. Afterward, people discussed what representation in books meant to them and shared titles that had mattered in their lives. Nobody asked about my personal story or my mother or anything private. We just talked about ideas and literature. Reconnecting with why I loved writing in the first place felt like finding solid ground again. The student reporter stopped me after English class on Friday. She looked excited and told me the journalism advisor had recognized her work covering the award situation. The advisor praised her balanced and ethical reporting of a sensitive topic. The reporter said she was thinking about investigative journalism as a career now. I told her I was glad something good came from all the documentation and articles. Her work had kept the focus on facts and policy instead of just drama. The counselor called me in during study hall the next week. She had a notepad and asked about my plans for the contest prize money. We worked through it together. Some would go toward books I wanted. Some would start a fund for a laptop since mine was old and slow. Some would be saved for future writing opportunities like workshops or contests with entry fees. Focusing on concrete resources instead of symbolic victory felt grounding and practical. I logged into the school forum that evening and wrote a post. I thanked people who had supported the policy changes and noted the new protections without listing personal problems or calling anyone out by name. The tone focused on moving forward rather than staying stuck in past conflict. Several people commented with supportive messages. A few others argued in the replies, but I did not engage with those. I had said what I needed to say. Several weeks went by with regular school routines. I returned to the library during free period one afternoon and noticed something new. Students were reading the contest-winning essays displayed on the back wall. The new rules meant everything was anonymous with just grade levels shown. No names, no photos allowed, no way to connect work to specific students. The system working exactly as intended gave me quiet satisfaction that settled warm in my chest. My best friend found me at my locker before last period. She had her backpack slung over one shoulder and looked nervous but determined. She told me she had started writing her own essays about recovery and mental health. Watching me navigate everything with Mrs. Kirk and the complaint process had inspired her. She said seeing me willing to be visible helped her find her own voice. Knowing my choice to speak up had given her courage made everything feel worthwhile. All the uncomfortable meetings and public attention and careful boundary setting had created space for someone else to tell their story. That mattered more than any award or recognition ever could. The English teacher handed out packets on Monday morning and explained the new essay unit. She walked through guidelines about craft elements like metaphor development and revision techniques. The content guidelines made it clear that personal topics were optional, not required. Students could write about ideas, experiences, observations, or arguments. The focus would be on how well they built their case and developed their language. I appreciated seeing the contest controversy translate into actual classroom practice. The teacher emphasized that strong writing came from careful word choice and structural decisions, not from having dramatic material. Several students asked questions about the revision process. The teacher showed examples of early drafts versus final versions, pointing out specific changes that strengthened the work. I took notes on her comments about metaphor consistency and paragraph transitions. The institutional learning felt concrete and useful, rather than just symbolic. The notification arrived in my email 2 weeks later. My essay had been selected as a regional finalist out of hundreds of entries. The message explained that all finalist essays would be published in a printed anthology distributed to schools across 3 counties. I would also receive an invitation to attend a weekend Young Writers workshop in the spring. The selection committee included college professors and published authors who evaluated entries based purely on writing quality. No names or school information had been attached to submissions during the judging process. Reading that my work had been recognized for craft rather than content gave me a specific kind of validation. This wasn't about my story being sad enough or interesting enough. This was about the actual writing being strong enough to stand with other skilled student work. The workshop took place at a community college campus on a Saturday in March. About 30 student writers showed up from different schools and districts. Some wore expensive clothes and arrived in new cars. Others took the bus or got dropped off by parents in older vehicles. Nobody asked about our backgrounds or family situations. The workshop leaders divided us into small groups to discuss craft techniques. I ended up with 4 other students analyzing how to build effective metaphors. One girl explained her process for finding comparisons that felt fresh but not forced. A boy shared his method for testing whether metaphors carried through an entire piece or just appeared once. We traded essays and marked places where language worked well or fell flat. The conversation focused entirely on skill development and revision strategies. Finding a community of writers who cared about technique rather than trauma felt like discovering my actual people. The librarian caught me at my usual table during free period the following week. She asked if I would be willing to mentor younger students interested in entering next year's essay contest. I agreed immediately, but set clear boundaries about what I would teach. My focus would be revision techniques and metaphor development, not personal story selection. She nodded and said that was exactly what she hoped I would offer. The younger students needed to learn that strong writing came from craft decisions, not just interesting experiences. We scheduled the first mentoring session for the next month. Teaching others about the actual work of writing helped me reclaim my identity. I was a writer who had faced controversy, not a controversy who happened to write. 6 weeks after the award ceremony, I sat at the library table working on a new essay about the power of careful word choice. The piece explored how single word substitutions could shift entire meanings and change reader understanding. I was deep in a paragraph about connotation when the librarian stopped by my table. She told me someone had just checked out 3 books based on my recommendation display near the front desk. I had created the display 2 weeks earlier, featuring books that had mattered to me at different points. The librarian said the student spent 20 minutes reading my note cards before selecting titles. I smiled and returned to my essay draft. The steady focus on the work itself rather than the noise around it felt right. My fingers moved across the keyboard, testing different word choices and watching how meanings shifted. The library was quiet except for the sound of pages turning and keyboards clicking. This was the part that mattered: the careful attention to language, the slow work of revision, the satisfaction of finding exactly the right word in exactly the right place. And that's where we'll leave Elizabeth's journey today. I hope something in this story stuck with you. If you enjoyed it, subscribing would mean the world to me, truly. Thanks so much for spending your time here. See you soon.